Now let's kick off with the latest on worsening relations between the world's two biggest economies. As coronavirus continues its deadly path across America, President Trump says he doesn't want to talk to the Chinese President Xi Jinping right now. Now, the U.S. president, who has previously blamed China for the pandemic, also speculated about severing trade ties between the two countries. Well, my guest this morning is a former diplomat, author, and advisor on emerging markets. I'm very pleased to welcome to the program Anja Manuel, a former U.S. State Department official, director of the Aspen Security Forum. She's also author of this Brave New World, China, India, and the U.S. And I know you're also joining us from far away, so you're also brave for that, Anja. The concern between the U.S. and China right now is that actually we have a second wave of a trade war, something ugly which will get President Trump possibly reelected. How damaging would that be to both economies?
Thank you for having me, Francine. Very happy to be there. A second trade war would be very damaging, and I would say we haven't ended the first trade war. We're still in the middle of the phase one trade deal. It hasn't been implemented. It's going to be very difficult for China to do so, and I would say this is the worst I've ever seen U.S.-China relations. They're really in free fall. 2/3 of Americans now think negatively about China. That's up 20% from just 2 years ago. And the presidential campaigns, both the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign, seem to be trying to outdo each other on how tough they could be on China.
Anja, you co-wrote this fantastic piece for the Washington Post, which basically explains how the U.S. should reuse some of the stimulus money to actually counter China. As you rebuild the economy in the U.S., what are the top three points that you would give to the current administration?
Thank you for asking about that. You know, policy so far been mostly focused on defense. How can we build a moat around our technology, keep Chinese investments out, keep our technology in? Increasingly, there is very difficult conversation and legislation even being proposed on the Hill. One senator saying recently we shouldn't allow Chinese students to study science and technology in the U.S. I think instead we should be focusing on what we all can do in the U.S. and Europe to lift our own people up instead of tearing China down. For example, you could do a lot on scientific research and development. It would create positive jobs and it would allow us to compete with China rather than just focusing on the negative.
There's something that's been seen a little bit of a victory for President Trump, which is the Taiwan Semiconductor actually planning to spend some $12 billion building a chip plant in Arizona. Are we going to see supply chains around the world, Anja, being upended? And what does that mean for foreign relations? Is China going to become weaker or stronger because of the way that the virus is ripping through our economies?
It's a very good question. I do think here you see a massive amount of decoupling, especially in the tech space between China and the U.S. You mentioned semiconductor foundries moving back to the United States. I think that will be limited because these foundries, of course, are very expensive. I think to a small extent, that's appropriate because the highest, most sophisticated microchips that go into technologies that go into UK or American defense technologies, for example, maybe we should be very careful where those are made. But for the vast amount of goods that are made in China, honestly, we should continue to do business as usual, and we should not be reshoring those things.
Anja, when you look at the fight between the U.S. and China, what's it actually about? Is it, world supremacy? Is it about the technology race? Is it about something much bigger?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I think increasingly you hear it about being ideology. In Washington, some conservatives are going so far as to call for the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party. It's an authoritarian regime. It has a lot to answer for in terms of where the virus came from and human rights abuses, lots of other things. But increasingly, this is becoming an ideological contest that in the United States is being described as a new Cold War. And I think that doesn't help anyone. Better would be to help lift ourselves up and to compete rather than push them down.
And Anja, you also mentioned that in a recent Pew poll, I think 66% of Americans have a negative view on China. Does China have a reputation problem, and should they care about it?
They do have a reputation problem, certainly in the United States. Now, you never know. This is a very recent poll, I think from a few weeks ago. You never know how much of that is the negative rhetoric you're hearing inside the U.S. Over and over again about China, and how much is actually China's behavior, which frankly hasn't been stellar, and under President Xi Jinping has gotten increasingly authoritarian. So some of those things may move back, and the pendulum may swing back towards something more normal. But will we ever go back to the world where China and the United States are largely trade partners and keep their problems under wrap and in control? I think it's highly unlikely.
Anja Manuel, thanks so much. Co-founder and partner at Rice, Hadley, Gates & Manuel, stays with us. Now, later today, we also hear exclusively from the OPEC Secretary General. Don't miss that conversation with Mohammed Barkindo. That's at 3 p.m. London time. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Anja Manuel from Rice, Hadley, Gates and Manuel is still with us. Anja, I know you're a great student of foreign policy and foreign affairs for a long time. Are we underestimating the deep shift that we'll see in globalization and the rise of China and this trade war and this fight between China and the U.S. in 4 to 5 years?
We're certainly seeing a sea change and an enormous shift. I think in 4 to 5 years, even if you have an election in the United States, if Joe Biden becomes the president, you probably won't go back to the world from 2015, 2016, where companies were doing everything possible to make their supply chains efficient, and that meant having them all over the world. Anecdotally, I speak to a lot of American businesses, and President Trump or not President Trump, they're thinking about how to make their supply chains a little bit closer to home, a little bit more resilient in the face of things like pandemics and lots of global political upheaval. So I think you're really seeing a vast shift.
What does it mean for, does it translate into more populism if countries are a little bit more inward looking, or is that just too simplistic right now?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of populism, certainly in the UK, in the United States, but then also in Turkey, in Brazil, increasingly. Prime Minister Modi in India sounds like a populist. Certainly, that's the wave we're living through. Will it last beyond 4 or 5 years from now? I'm not sure. And I hope that this pendulum swings back to something more moderate in world politics.
What does foreign policy under a second term President Trump, if he gets reelected in November, actually look like for the world?
President Trump, now almost 4 years into his term, has a foreign policy team that he feels comfortable with and that he works pretty well with, from Mark Esper at Defense to Pompeo at State to Robert O'Brien at the NSC. They seem to have, after much personnel upheaval, hit their stride. And it is a very hard-edged foreign policy. As you know, in addition to what's going on with China, we've pulled out of the deal with Iran. There's no new deal in sight. There's not much happening in the negotiations with North Korea. We've pulled out of the Paris Climate Change Accord. And I think in a second term, you'll see more of the same.
What does it mean in general for some of the countries that will be on the back end of trade wars? Does President Trump, do you believe this administration thinks that trade wars actually work? Because so far, they seem to have won, actually.
I'm not sure that the farmers in our Midwestern states would think they've won. We have more farm bankruptcies than we've had in decades. In the end, the American people are paying the price for these tariffs that are being put in place. Many are still holding still, but how long does that continue? And do they blame outside forces rather than the president themselves? I'm not so sure. So we're winning from the trade war, and I think increasingly the American people will catch on to that.
Anja, you were a diplomat. You work with, very high-level diplomats day in, day out. How has diplomacy changed in the last 4 years across the world?
Oh, it's a very good question. I was at the U.S. State Department now more than a decade ago. And I have to tell you, when I was there across Republican and Democratic administrations, the foreign policy professionals were in the lead. And now many of the senior professionals, especially at the State Department, have left. A lot of them haven't been replaced. So a lot of the normal things that you would be watching, to have regional assistant secretaries watching what's going on in Africa, what's going on in Asia, a lot of those positions, even 3.5 years in, aren't 100% filled. And I think it has an impact. You see it when you have crises like this and no one's watching what's going on outside of the main event, which in these cases is certainly the pandemic.
Anja Manuel, thank you so much for joining us from Rice, Hadley, Gates and Manuel.